Hello again, this is David A. Kelly, the author of the Ballpark Mystery Books and the MVP series. I'm happy to be here with you again for another edition of the Ballpark Mysteries Live. Today we're going to be looking at my book, The Baltimore Bandit. It's Ballpark Mysteries number 15, and it takes place in Baltimore at Camden Yards. That's the Baltimore Orioles Stadium. And before we get into that, I want to remind you to go ahead and visit my website, davidakellybooks.com, if you want additional information on any of my books, the Ballpark Mystery Series or the MVP series or the 2 nonfiction books that I've written. And you can also look there for teacher's guides and some missing chapters if you want to go behind the scenes on some of the books. I also have a sign up for an email newsletter. And if you'd like to purchase signed or autographed books, please look there as well. There's a button where you can actually shop my online store for signed books. So thanks for joining me again. And if you want to see any of the previous Ballpark Mysteries live shows that I've done, you can consult my Ballpark Mysteries Facebook page, and you'll see some of the videos for the previous ones. Last week we did the San Francisco Splash. Before that, I think it was the Wrigley Riddle. We've also done the first Ballpark Mystery book, the Fenway Foul-Up, that takes place in Boston, the Colorado Curveball, and we've done my picture book, Miracle Mud. So that's kind of a cool one to take in. And then I also did one which was a complete ballpark tour. So you can actually get a tour of all the Ballpark Mysteries ballparks. So you get a little bit of behind the scenes from each one. But again, thanks for joining me. I will be taking questions. So just put any questions you have in the comments area and hope to get to those at the end of the presentation. So thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. And let's dive into the Baltimore Bandit. So I'm going to be reading a little bit of the first chapter to you later on in the broadcast. But before I do that, I wanted to show you some of the research that I do for this book. So before I start writing a Ballpark Mysteries book, one of the first things I do is I take a research trip to whatever team or stadium I'm writing about. So in this case, that means a trip down to Baltimore. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for interesting things or different things about the team or the stadium or the team's history that I might be able to incorporate into the mystery. And it helps me come up with what might make a good mystery for that team or stadium. So what I'm going to show you today are some of the slides, some of the pictures that I took when I was there. And not all of the pictures or interesting information actually make it into any of these stories. When I do the research trip, I'm collecting a lot of information, and only some of it makes it into the story. It really depends upon what direction the story takes. So give me just a second, and let me share my screen here. And here we're going to, there we go. And there we go. So you should now see me and a screen with all my books on it. And this slide shows the 16 Ballpark Mysteries books that are team books on the left-hand side. So it starts off with the Boston Red Sox mystery called the Fenway Foul-Up, and it continues to the most recent book. This is called the Colorado Curveball. Really fun book. It came out about 3 months ago. Takes place in Denver, Colorado, and there's some cool things happening in this book. So if you haven't picked it up, I'd really recommend that you do. And then on the right-hand side of the page, you can see that there are the 4 super specials that are listed. These are Ballpark Mystery super specials that are about 3 or 4 chapters longer than the standard Ballpark Mystery book. And they take place in a World Series, a Little League World Series, the Cooperstown Hall of Fame, and a special New York Mets, New York Yankees Subway Series book. Then in addition to that, I have the MVP books, which I've talked about before. These are mysteries set in other sports. So if you like soccer, basketball, football, or Olympics, these are fun books to read as a follow-on to the Ballpark Mystery books. And then I also have those 2 nonfiction books down at the bottom of the screen, Babe Ruth and the Baseball Curse, part of which actually takes place in Baltimore. And hopefully I'll come back at a later episode and talk a little bit more about this book, because there are just some really cool things about Babe Ruth, as well as the 2004 Red Sox that I covered in this book. And the other one is that picture book called Miracle Mud, which tells the story of this really strange stuff. Lena Blackburn baseball rubbing mud. There's a tub of the mud. Comes from a secret place in New Jersey. Nobody knows where it is, but it's rubbed on all the Major League Baseballs. So actually go to my Facebook page for Ballpark Mysteries and check out that other video if you're interested in the Lena Blackburn baseball rubbing mud story. But what we're here today to talk about is the Baltimore Bandit. So this is a fun book. Mike and Kate are in Baltimore, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the story when we get to it. And they're going to go to Camden Yards. So let me proceed on the presentation. So there's the cover of the book. I just showed it to you. And as I said, this takes place in Baltimore at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. We'll come back to the name in just a second. But here's a nice view of the stadium. And you can kind of see the big warehouse. The upper right part of this picture is called the B&O warehouse. It's a railroad. It's an old railroad warehouse. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. They have that nice scoreboard in the middle of the outfield, right to the right of the batter's eye. And then they have a nice view of the city. So it's a really interesting park, a great place to see a baseball game. So a little bit of geography. I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage here. This is a Google map of Baltimore, and you can kind of see Baltimore as a harbor right next to it. That's the blue stuff, the water, near the National Aquarium and the Science Center. And the downtown area is just kind of northwest of the harbor, and right there is the Orioles Stadium. But there are also some other really interesting things in the area, and we're going to get to these later in the presentation as well. So a little bit further west of the downtown area is the old location of the St. Mary's Home for boys, and that's actually where Babe Ruth grew up. So we'll come back to that. I just wanted to show you where it was geographically. And then over on the right of the peninsula of the harbor is actually Fort McHenry. We will talk about this as well, but that you might know that as the home of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, almost right next to the stadium is actually the birthplace of Babe Ruth. It's a brick house where he was born and grew up for his early part of his life until he was sent to the St. Mary's Home Industrial School for Boys, and we'll get to that later on. And then just a little bit north of both the stadium and Babe Ruth's birthplace are some places related to Edgar Allan Poe, a very famous writer. And there's a house that he lived in as well as his gravesite. And I'll show you some pictures from those shortly. And then there's also a railroad museum. Railroads play a very important part in the history of Baltimore, as well as in Camden Yards. So let's look at some of the stats. For Camden Yards. Camden Yards stats, Camden Yards opened in 1992, and it's a very interesting baseball stadium because it's really on the dividing line between the old style stadiums and the new style stadiums, which are kind of the old style stadiums. So before Camden Yards opened, the predominant approach to building baseball stadiums had actually been kind of multi-function. So baseball stadiums are also football stadiums, baseball stadiums that could be used for multiple purposes. That meant that the configuration of the stadiums actually wasn't ideal for baseball. It placed people too far away from the field because you had to have maybe a rectangular type field availability. And they just weren't purpose-built for baseball. They were kind of used for multiple purposes. And it was very popular in the 60s and 70s. But when the Orioles looked at building a new stadium in the late 80s and early 90s, the team ownership decided they really wanted a baseball stadium, and not just a baseball stadium, but they wanted one that had a retro look. And that was kind of guided by the chief architectural designer, Janet Marie Smith, who actually went on to consult here in Boston at Fenway Park with the redesign of Fenway Park after the Boston Red Sox were purchased. And so she had a big influence on the look and the feel of baseball stadiums. And they really wanted them to kind of evoke more of the history of baseball, which is actually great for me as a writer, because there is so much history specifically in Baltimore, as well as with the Orioles and some of the other teams. So I find that really exciting. One other thing that's kind of interesting about the Baltimore Orioles Stadium is the name. The official name is Oriole Park at Camden Yards. And that's because when they named the stadium, there were kind of two factions. The team wanted to name it Oriole Park, but Camden Yards was the name of the area and the former railroad termination, the building where the B&O building was. And the mayor and other people really wanted to have the historical name preserved. So they actually had a compromise. They decided Oriole Park at Camden Yards would be the full name of the stadium. So that's why we ended up with that. The capacity is reasonably large, about 45,000 people. It's a little bit above that. So it's a good sized place to see a game. It has been higher, but like many stadiums, they've lowered it over the years. And the B&O warehouse that you can see in the background there, we'll come back to this, but actually it's never been hit during a baseball game. So it is a little bit too far away unless you get the perfect pitch. And Baltimore Camden Yards is actually where Ken Griffey Jr., a very famous player, as well as an important member of the Baltimore Orioles organization, actually broke the record for the most consecutive games that a baseball player has played in. He beat Lou Gehrig's previous record of 2,130 games. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes as well. Let me advance. So I have a few interesting things about Camden Yards to show you. So one thing is it's called Birdland, and you may get that from the Baltimore Orioles mascot or the name. But here's another view of the stadium with a full view of the B&O Railroad warehouse. And it, again, is a beautiful place to see a game. And here's a picture that I took when I was doing research. So typically when I travel to these stadiums, I spend 4 or 5 days doing research for the Baltimore Orioles, since it's relatively close, about a day's drive away from Boston. I did a couple of trips down there at different periods of time. So this is a night game that I went to. And what you can see behind me is actually that scoreboard. And again, it gives you a feel how they wanted to preserve this kind of legacy feel, retro feel for the ballpark. And it's very kind of ornate with the clock on top of it. It's actually a beautiful scoreboard and a beautiful stadium. So here's another view of the field. And this is during the day, during a tour I took of the stadium, just the way you would take a tour of the stadium. I take a lot of pictures and a lot of notes because, again, I'm looking for interesting information. And here's a view from home plate. Here's the other side of that scoreboard. You can see that, and the view from the downtown, or of the downtown, with the warehouse in the back right. And this is actually one of the things that we used in the stadium. So here is an illustration from the illustrator, Mark Mayers. Mark Mayers has been a terrific illustrator of the Ballpark Mystery Series. I really love all the work that he's done. So I'm pulling out a few selected pieces from his work to show you. And here's how he rendered the B&O building as well as the field with Mike and Kate on it. This is from the first chapter, and you'll get this now that Mike is imagining hitting a baseball. I did want to show you a real Baltimore Oriole, even though this isn't a real one. It's an illustration of a real one. So that's where the name comes from. It was named after Lord Baltimore because he had the orange colors on his coat of arms, and they thought that this bird with the orange colors reminded them of Lord Baltimore's coat of arms. And so that's how this bird was named. It's actually a very pretty little bird. And they have other versions of the bird. Here's the cartoon or logo version of the Baltimore Orioles bird. And when I was there, I got to meet him, and I had a nice time meeting him. A little bit of a different kind of a creature, but he sure is fun to watch a baseball game with. So I had fun seeing the game with the bird. So let's talk a little bit about the team. The Baltimore Orioles actually have some hardware. So a little hard to see perhaps, but you can see a couple of World Series trophies there. They have 3 World Series that they've won. And they've got some of that hardware on display. You can see some gold gloves in that cabinet. And again, when I'm taking the tour, this is the kind of thing I'm thinking about and looking for as I build the mystery. So could something happen to these World Series trophies? Could somebody steal them? Could the gold gloves be stolen, or could the gold be melted off of them? So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm taking the pictures and touring the stadium with the tour guide. I'm kind of thinking about what could happen if Mike and Kate were here. So the Baltimore Orioles also are a great team because they have a lot of history. They have a lot of famous players. So here's a list of the 12 players from the Orioles that have made it to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. That's great for me. I don't incorporate them into the stories directly, but sometimes I build off of those important characters or important players. The other thing I do when I'm touring a baseball stadium is I look around. Again, I'm looking for anything interesting. So here is an Old Bay seafood food stand, and I look at the food stands because those can vary a lot from stadium to stadium. So this is something very specific to Baltimore. We'll come back to the crabs in a few slides, but I will just flag that both the crabs and the Old Bay seasoning are a pretty important part of Baltimore and Maryland and the Baltimore Orioles experience, and that's why I actually featured them kind of in this book. So another example of something that I take a picture of when I'm touring is here's the condiment stand. Sometimes it's just ketchup, mustard, relish, and that's kind of it. But you can see actually the Baltimore Orioles here have the Old Bay seasoning, which we'll come back to. They've got some hot sauce there, and they've got, I think, some mayonnaise on the right in that blue container. So a little bit different. I never know if it's going to actually fit into the story if I need to use it, but I'd rather have the information first. So they also have an area in their ballpark called the Kids Corner. And this is something I grabbed a couple of pictures of here. So they had this inflatable skee ball and they had this climbing structure. And I actually pay attention to these because in this book, Mike and Kate, there's actually kind of a kids corner where they get their picture taken with a parrot. So again, here's one of Mark's illustrations. They don't actually have a parrot at the Baltimore Orioles Camden Yards Stadium. I just made that up. As a writer, I can do that. But I was envisioning that kids area for the location for this kind of shop. And if you read the book, you'll find out there's an important reason that I needed it to be a parrot. You might be able to guess that parrots have the capability of talking or mimicking voices, and that could be pretty helpful in a detective story. So here's a picture of Mike and Kate getting their picture taken with a special Baltimore Orioles parrot. He's actually wearing a little sweater vest that is a Baltimore Orioles type sweater vest. And if you go online, you can actually find people that make clothes for birds, which I never knew, but when I was researching this book, that's one of the things I found out. Another thing important here is barbecue. So this is Boog's Barbecue at Camden Yards. It's kind of featured right in the main entrance, and they do a pretty good business, and you can really smell the barbecue when you're there. Of course, Mike, who loves to eat, is very interested in the barbecue place, so that's included in the story. And sometimes they say the smoke from the barbecue gives the players an indication of which way the wind is blowing. So here's another view of that warehouse. This is the B&O, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Warehouse. This is the other side of the warehouse away from the baseball stadium. So the baseball stadium is on the other side of the warehouse. And it's actually the longest building on the East Coast. It's over 1,000 feet long. It's kind of 6 buildings are all built together and integrated. And it's owned by the same people that own Camden Yards and the Baltimore Orioles. And it's basically an office building. They've rehabbed it, refurbished it, so that it's in great shape. But it is beautiful to see. It's an amazing amount of bricks, and it's just a really cool setting for a baseball stadium. So one of the things that the Baltimore Orioles do is they offer, I think it's on Sundays, every Sunday, every home game, they allow kids, fans to run the bases. And some of the other baseball stadiums do this as well. And I thought this was great, and I really wanted to include this in one of the books, so I actually included it in the Baltimore Bandit. When Mike and Kate are there, as you'll see, the first chapter starts off with them running the bases, and it becomes the basis for part of the mystery here. So here's another one of Mark Mayer's pictures with Mike and Kate about to run the bases together. I thought it'd be kind of fun to have a race between them. and they're right at home plate. It's kind of starting that, and it's a fun part of the first chapter that we'll get to very shortly. So some other things that you see if you were to take a tour of the Baltimore Stadium, you're going to see most tours take you to a press room. And in some of my books, like in the first book, The Fenway Foul-Up, Mike and Kate actually go to the press room because Kate's mother works as a reporter, so she is frequently in the press room. And this is just a pretty typical way that a press room looks. Long rows of desks usually tiered. There might be 2 tiers or 3 tiers of desks and chairs. The windows on the left, they're actually closed. Those are just kind of awnings that they've lowered down. But when the game starts, they raise those up. So you basically have open windows right onto the field. You typically do have to watch out for baseballs, foul balls that might get hit. And I think in this press room, you can see all these dents on the ceiling and the back wall from the balls that have come in. So if you're a reporter watching the game from the press room, you definitely have to keep your eyes on the field. Otherwise, you might get clocked with a really hard baseball. So this is the press room. And then here, right next to on the other side of the press room is actually a broadcast booth. This is, I think, basically directly behind home plate. And it's all covered over, but you can see the desk in the middle where the anchors would be doing the broadcast. And again, the sheets of plastic are behind them, but they would open those up for the game, so you'd have a great view of the field. And this is something I came across kind of interesting to see. It's basically just the schedule before a game. This was for a game in August 2016, and the game starts at 7:05, but the schedule for the kind of pregame activity starts at 6:40. It starts off with a welcome announcement on the scoreboard, and they talk about the different things that are happening on the scoreboard, as well as some awards they give out. And then they put out the time frame for when the umpires and the managers have to meet at home plate. They meet at 6:58. And then at 7:01 p.m., the Orioles take the field. They do the national anthem, which again we'll come back to shortly. And 7:05 is the first pitch. So it's a heavily scripted, very tightly timed process before these games start. And that's something that I could certainly come back to in a future mystery. Something might happen to something like this, or the schedule might get messed up, or somebody might mess up that manager umpire meeting at home plate. There's a lot of things that could happen that would make for an interesting mystery that Mike and Kate might be involved in. So this kind of thing I just look at for future information and kind of see how I might be able to use it. So switching gears, this is an area behind left field, I think, either center field. It's kind of right near the batter's eye, which is this big green wall at Oriole Stadium, which is directly behind the pitcher. So in a baseball game, they don't want anything distracting behind the pitcher. They don't want the batter to get distracted and take his eye off the ball or lose the ball, because it could be deadly, basically. If you get hit in the head with a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, you don't want to have that happen. So Major League Baseball has these areas called batter's eyes, and they're empty areas of the park that don't have anything going on. And in front of the batter's eye at Camden Yards, they're actually growing extra grass. So if something happens to the turf on the field, they can actually cut up strips of it and basically treat it like sod and put it into the damaged area inside the stadium. So you can see that they've cut out different sections of this field to replace certain grass areas in the stadium. And I thought that was just kind of cool. So the stadium also has an area right to the right of center field called the Flag Courtyard. And this isn't the best picture of it, but it's the one I got. And it's a sequence of flags. And it's also a big patio area that overlooks the field. So it's a great place to watch a game if you want to get out of your seat and kind of stretch and kind of look down on the field. It's a beautiful feature of the baseball stadium. But the flags are basically flags of American League teams, and they're flown in order of the standings. So again, just kind of a cool feature. I didn't include that as part of the mystery in the Baltimore Bandit, but it's this kind of thing that I think about to see if there is a way to include it when I'm writing the story. So the stadium, if you were with me for the Boston Red Sox behind the scenes tour, I showed you a red seat at Fenway Park. Most of the seats are green, like the picture you see in front of you, but there is a red seat at Fenway Park, which has a special significance. And in the Baltimore Orioles Stadium, there are actually two orange seats, very much like that red seat, that have special significances. So this is the red seat. It's kind of in, I think, kind of right field. And it shows the location of Eddie Murray's home run, his 500th home run. He is in the Hall of Fame, very famous Baltimore Oriole player. And then on the other side of the field, I think it's on the left field seats, there's a home run from Cal Ripken, I believe, or maybe Ken Griffey. I forget which one it is. Actually, Cal Ripken Jr. There's another orange seat there. So you got two orange seats. And again, I didn't actually work these into the mystery, but it's something that I could do depending upon what direction the mystery takes. And on August 22nd, 2007, the Baltimore Orioles had a really bad day. Here's the final score for a game. Texas Rangers 30, Baltimore Orioles 3 after 9 innings. 30-3. That's the most runs scored in a baseball game in 110 years. So it probably felt pretty good for the Texas Rangers and not so good for the Baltimore Orioles. Not something I could work into the story, but kind of just a cool fact to know about, unless you're a Baltimore Orioles fan. So also in the stadium, basically in the left field plaza area, right after you go in the entranceway, there is an area where they have a bunch of statues. So they have, I think it's 6 statues of famous Baltimore Oriole players, including Eddie Murray, who hit that home run with the orange seat that we just talked about, Jim Palmer, who we'll talk about shortly, Cal Ripken, Frank Robinson, Brooks Robinson, and Earl Weaver. And that's Earl Weaver to the left. He was a really famous Baltimore Orioles manager for a long period of time. But again, these are something that I might be able to use in the mystery. I did not use them in this case, but it's the kind of thing that I think about, how could I include that as part of the mystery? And there's also outside the stadium, so actually kind of just behind this statue is where the other statues are. There's a statue of Babe Ruth, and I mentioned this, I think, in the Ballpark Mysteries Ballpark tour that we did a few weeks ago. But this is a statue of Babe Ruth because he originally played for the Baltimore Orioles. He was from Baltimore and has a really close connection to the city, and they honored him with this, and I will tell you a little bit more about this later. But if you look, he's got standing there with his bat as well as a baseball glove. But there's a little bit of a problem with the baseball glove because Babe Ruth was actually a lefty. He batted left and he threw left, which means that he had the glove on his right hand so he could throw with his left hand. But the glove that he's holding in the statue is a right-hander's glove. Someone who throws with their right hand, that glove in his hand there would actually be worn on the left hand. So it was not a glove that he would have used, but it was used as the model for the sculpture, for the statue, and that was a mistake that the Orioles organization made when they gave a glove to the sculptor to actually base the glove on. But I'll show you more about that in a few minutes as well, and that actually plays into the story. There's a Babe Ruth in my story. There's a Babe Ruth glove that's on display. And so here's Mike and Kate. Here's, again, Mark's illustration of that statue, which I think he does a great job. And there's actually a Babe Ruth baseball glove on display in my story, not in the real life, that something happens to, that Mike and Kate have to basically find. So that's the big mystery in this book, is that there's a missing Babe Ruth baseball glove. So again, just to wrap up this section of the presentation, kind of a nice view of the fields and the B&O warehouse in the back. It's a great place to see a game. There's a scoreboard. There's the batter's eye on the left part of the field with those extra grass that can be used to replace any problems on the rest of the field. So I did mention Birdland. That's the nickname for the park, and that's because there are a lot of birds. So here's another picture of that scoreboard from the main entrance side. It's a beautiful scoreboard. I really like what they did with it. And here is the mascot. And the mascot for the Baltimore Orioles has a really interesting name, It's called the Oriole Bird. That's it. They don't have any fun name for it. It's just the Oriole Bird. You can see some kids meeting him here. Kind of a cool mascot. Maybe not as fun as the Philly Fanatic, but still a pretty cool mascot. But they also have a lot of birds. So here is a sign in the stadium that shows an evolution of the Baltimore Oriole birds. And you can see the one on the left all the way to 1954 to 64 for 10 years. It was this kind of basic cartoon type bird. And then they actually came out with other versions of him. So there's one that's kind of looking, there's one that's batting, there's one carrying a bat, there's an angry one called the Cuckoo Bird, and there's even a baby bird. So they use these on different t-shirts and hats and logos and things like that. So they have a lot of fun with these different Baltimore Orioles birds. And here's a large version of the Cuckoo Bird, which is kind of cool. This is on the wall next to the drinking fountain. So right between the stadium and the B&O warehouse, there's a street, and it's called Utah. And it's called Utah, but it's actually spelled E-U-T-A-W. So kind of a strange spelling, maybe a phonetic spelling of the word Utah. And this is kind of a cool street. So here's a picture of the Utah street from the outside. This is before you go into the park. And on game days, this is basically where you have to give your ticket or provide your ticket to have entrance. But not on game days. You're actually free to walk down Utah Street. There are some restaurants and shops that are open, and you can actually take a peek inside the park. But unfortunately, you can't do that on game days. And actually, I just showed you last week, the San Francisco Stadium actually does have an area where you can peek in during the games and watch up to 3 innings of a baseball game at the San Francisco Giants Stadium. But you can't do that here. During the games, that gate would be open because all the people on the street would be ticket holders. They would have already paid to get into the stadium. And here's another shot of the street. You can see the B&O warehouse on the left, the ballpark on the right. There's a bunch of shops on the left. Here it is during the day. They have some restaurants, and they have the team store there, and they have a bunch of posters or banners of important players. And on the sidewalk here in between the stadium and the B&O warehouse, they actually have these markers. I think there's about 22 of them, and maybe a little bit more than that, that mark home runs that have been hit outside the stadium and have landed somewhere in the street. And so it's kind of cool because they tell who did it and the date of the game and how far it was, I think. So, yeah, here's one from David Ortiz, the Boston Red Sox. Go Sox. May 21st, 2012, and it says 423 feet, I think, or maybe 428 feet. And that's buried in the cement sidewalk in between the team stadium and the store. So kind of cool to see that. And there is one marker on the B&O warehouse itself. So this is on one of the stone pillars of the warehouse, and it shows where Ken Griffey Jr. from the Seattle Mariners actually hit a home run during the home run derby. So this wasn't during a game, so technically it wasn't really a home run during a league play, but it was during the home run derby, and it's the farthest baseball that's been hit out of the stadium and the only one that has hit the warehouse. So that's kind of cool to see that. And there's kind of a cool connection between the warehouse and the stadium because, again, I said these were both owned by the team. So this allows, I think the team offices are on the 2nd or 3rd floor. So it allows them to go directly from the stadium back to the team headquarters if they need to during the game. And you'll also see, I think, like the food services are on the 1st floor of that warehouse. So you'll see the beverage and food services people go back and forth there as well. And also on Utah Street in this area, they have a Baltimore Orioles Hall of Fame. So here are some plaques that honor important Orioles players over the years. And this is the bottom base, basically the base of the scoreboard. And one more version of Utah Street during a game. So you get a feeling for what it's like. There's a lot of action going on here during a game. Now, Baltimore, as I showed you, if you remember the geography I showed you, the stadium is just a little bit to the left of the harbor. And in Baltimore, the area that harbor is called the Inner Harbor. and they've done a lot of development. So there's a lot of restaurants and shops and bars around that. There's a walkway, there's a water taxi service, there's boats, a lot of cool things that you can do. And of course, when I was there, I researched a bunch of it, but it didn't really make it into the book or the story because it just didn't fit the mystery that I had developed for it. But in another book or another story, it might have played an important part in the mystery. So if you go to Baltimore, it's always fun to go to the Inner Harbor. Maybe they sometimes have performers, street performers. I saw a magician there. They have cool shops and some nice restaurants where you can catch an outdoor meal and maybe get some crabs. So as you've already probably figured, railroads are kind of important in Baltimore's history and specifically in Camden Yards because it was the kind of terminus for the B&O Railroad. They had the large warehouse where they would offload freight that had been shipped in and they would store it. And the Orioles converted that into the office that you see today. But there is actually a railroad museum in Baltimore. It's called the B&O Railroad Museum. It's a really cool thing. I showed it to you on the maps at the beginning of the presentation. So if you have a chance to go to Baltimore, check out the B&O Railroad Museum. It's this big roundhouse, and they have all these really nicely preserved trains and locomotives and cars, and they tell you the history of locomotives in that area. So here's another shot of locomotives in the roundhouse. And there's a very important train engine called Tom Thumb. It was in a race that's kind of important in the development of railroading. So cool to see. Again, I thought maybe Mike and Kate would go there, but it didn't really fit into the story. And I told you I'd tell you a little bit more about Babe Ruth. So Babe Ruth plays an important part, and Baltimore plays an important part in Babe Ruth's history. So, whoops, whoa, we went way too far there. So let me get back. A little bit farther here. There we go. Babe Ruth plays an important part in Baltimore's history. This is actually his birthplace where Babe Ruth was born. Babe Ruth is known for hitting a lot of home runs. He was a very famous baseball player. He set a home run record that lasted for a very long time until Hank Aaron came along in the 1970s. Babe Ruth played for the Boston Red Sox and for the New York Yankees, which is really where he's famous for. But he was originally signed by a minor league team called the Baltimore Orioles. And this is the house, the brick house that he was born in. And it's actually, as I showed you on the Google Maps slide, just a few blocks away from the stadium and from one of the stairways in the stadium. You can actually see the area where his house is. So you'd kind of, it looks the kind of way you would expect a house to look from the 1800s, 1890s. They have some rooms that are furnished with period decor and some of the furniture from that time, so you get an idea of what it looked like to live there. And they have some cool memorabilia, like some signed Babe Ruth baseballs. I would love to have one of those. I do have a signed Hank Aaron baseball, which is the baseball player that actually beat Babe Ruth's home run record, but I would still love to have a Babe Ruth baseball. And as I said, he did start out as an Oriole, so we will get to this, but Babe Ruth had a kind of a tough life when he was young. His parents were very busy working and basically didn't have time for Babe. So when he was about 7, they actually shipped him off to the St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, which is a little bit west of the stadium. I showed that to you on the map. And it was basically a place where orphaned kids went, or kids whose parents couldn't take care of them went. So Babe lived there until he was, I think, 16 or 17. And it was there that he learned to play baseball. And it was from there that he was actually signed by the minor league team, the Baltimore Orioles, to start playing baseball professionally. So they had him for a few months. They took him down to spring training in Florida. And then I think before the season started or shortly after it started, he was traded to the Boston Red Sox. So that's how Babe Ruth ended up on the Red Sox. He was there for about 3 years. And then the Red Sox, of course, traded him to the New York Yankees. But again, so this gives you a little bit of information about the Orioles. And the next slide here, you can see a baseball glove in the lower right-hand corner. So if you look at that glove, that's a glove that goes on your right hand. because you would be throwing with your left hand, and that's how Babe Ruth played. So he would have worn the glove on the right hand as a left-hander, and he would have thrown with his left hand. And that's not what you see on that statue that I showed you the picture of. So I wanted to mention a little bit about St. Mary's. It played a huge role in Babe Ruth's life. And so there's his uniform from when he was at St. Mary's. And here's actually a shot of St. Mary's. It's no longer St. Mary's Industrial School for the boys. It turned into other things. It was a Catholic school for quite a while. And then I don't know that it's anything right now, but you can go visit it. It's a little bit west of the stadium. This is a shot that I took. It's the former site of St. Mary's Industrial School for the boys. Here's another shot of the kind of grounds. It looks like not a bad place to live. And this is actually the location of the baseball field that Babe Ruth used to play on. It's now been turned into a soccer field and a football field. And the scoreboard says the Babe Ruth Field. You can't read it over there, but it says the Babe Ruth Field. So they do honor him a little bit, but it is no longer a baseball field. But it is kind of cool to be in that specific location where he learned to play. And I don't know, I saw this picture there, maybe lost teammates. I would have loved to play on the same team as Babe Ruth. I think it could have been possible. So that's a good picture of me and the Babe. So I mentioned that I'd be getting back to the crabs. So let's talk about crabs. Crabs are a pretty important part of Maryland. It's on the seashore. They harvest a lot of them. People love them. So there's a lot of importance placed on crabs, and you can get them, as I showed you, at the baseball stadium. I don't think you can do that at Fenway Park. But they also include seasoning. So this is a really important thing down there, is this Old Bay seasoning. So it's basically this kind of spicy, salty type of thing that you put on the crabs. And basically, you don't just put it on the crabs, you can put it on everything. So it's kind of fun because there's just a lot of Old Bay seasoning flavors when you're at the Camden Yards Stadium. So for example, here's Old Bay seasoned potato chips. I don't think they're seasoned like crabs. I think they're seasoned like the seasoning that goes on the crabs. So you'll see it kind of everywhere. And I used that theme of crabs in this because I really wanted to kind of play upon that. So one, those food stands and the crabs do play an important part in the plot, but I also, oh, actually, I'll come back to that plot in a second. On the scoreboard during the game, they actually have a crab shuffle. So here's an illustration. You can kind of see the clock at the top of the scoreboard there, and the name of the Sun, which was the newspaper. But the video screen is showing these three crabs that basically hide a baseball, and then they move around in a crazy manner. And you're supposed to figure out which crab has the hidden baseball. And the crowd votes on it, and then they show it to you. So it's kind of fun to watch that little video crab shuffle that happens every game. But the other way that I incorporated the crabs into the book was with crab soccer. I mean, I remember playing this when I was younger, and it was a lot of fun. So you probably played crab soccer at some point. So in this book, Mike and Kate are doing the investigation, and they're trying to figure out something. So one way that they're trying to kind of sneak up on somebody and investigate something is by playing crab soccer with a tennis ball that Mike is carrying with him. So this is a picture that Mark Mayers did of the crab soccer game that Mike and Kate are having at the stadium. And it's a really important part of the mystery. So this is at a very critical junction towards the end of the mystery. And I had a lot of fun finding a way to include that in the story because of all the connections to crabs. So I also wanted to mention the characters. So in this story, there is a pitcher, and the pitcher's name is Flaps, and he's an important part of the story. And Flaps is actually modeled on a real Baltimore Orioles player called Jim Palmer, who was around when I was growing up. And he was kind of one of my favorite baseball players at the time. I liked the Baltimore Orioles. And he had the name Cakes. Jim Palmer had the nickname Cakes because he loved to eat pancakes every day before he pitched. He thought it brought him good luck. So I kind of included that in this book with the character Flaps, who eats flapjacks or pancakes before every game. And Mike and Kate actually have some pancakes with them, and they learn some important things that help them solve the mystery. So this was kind of fun for me to include this reference to Jim Palmer or Cakes in the story as the character Flaps. And again, I've mentioned this guy before, the Iron Man. I did not include him in the story. He is included in the dugout notes section, which is at the end of the story, where I include some nonfiction information. But Cal Ripken Jr., very famous Baltimore Orioles player. He finished, he actually broke, as I said, Lou Gehrig's record of 30 consecutive games played. Cal Ripken finished with 2632. So 2,632 consecutive games played without taking a game off. That requires incredible fortitude. So he didn't make it into the story, but he is one of the things I think about when I'm writing the story. He also, there were other Ripkens that played baseball. And so here's a picture of all three of them, his father. I mentioned the national anthem. Before every baseball game, we have the national anthem, and it actually comes from Baltimore. And this is something I would have loved to have included in the book, or maybe have Mike and Kate visit, but it just didn't fit into the story. But the national anthem was written by Francis Scott Key. You probably know that. At Fort McHenry. He was offshore watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 by the British, and he was basically writing it as he watched the American flag still stay standing after the bombardment, and it inspired him to write the national anthem. So, or the Star Spangled Banner, which then became the national anthem. And you can go visit Fort McHenry. It's actually right near downtown Baltimore, and it is a beautiful place to visit right there in the harbor. But again, I didn't have a chance to have Mike and Kate go there. And lastly, I did want to include some references to Edgar Allan Poe in the story, because Edgar Allan Poe is a very famous writer. He is connected with Baltimore, and he's also connected with mystery stories. So here's a picture of Edgar. Looks like he could have used maybe a haircut and some shampoo or something. But he was a troubled writer, but a prolific writer. And I named in this book, there's the parrot. You can kind of see the parrot on the cover right over here. And again, I love how Mark did the illustration, but that parrot is named Edgar in reference to Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is important to me because he basically invented the detective story. So before him, there weren't really these detective stories with a mystery and clues that were solved. And Edgar Allan Poe basically invented the genre of the detective story. So since I write mystery and detective stories, it's kind of important for me to include him here. You can actually go see his house. It used to be open as a museum. I don't know if it's currently open or not, but this is a house that he lived in for a number of years. He moved here in 1832 to escape a cholera epidemic from a different part of Baltimore. He got married, they believe, in this house. And then after this house, he moved down to Richmond, Virginia. But he kind of switched from writing poetry. He had previously been writing poetry to writing stories in this house. And many of his famous stories and detective stories came after this period of time. Now, Poe is also actually buried in Baltimore. It's relatively close to the stadium. It's a few blocks away. You can go see this marker that marks his gravesite. He died October 7th, 1849. But his death has a very strange story. He basically disappeared for some number of days in Baltimore. And when they found him, he was basically dressed in somebody else's clothes. He was left on the street in a very disheveled, unfortunate situation, and he later died. And people don't actually know what happened to him, whether there was some kind of medical problem. There's been conjecture that it had to do with voting, because sometimes they would, this was near a day of voting, and sometimes they would actually pay people with alcohol to actually dress up in other people's clothes and vote multiple times. So there's some conjecture that maybe he was doing that. Unfortunately, whatever it was, he met his end in Baltimore and is buried there. And that is the end of our little tour of Baltimore. Probably an appropriate place to end. So I'm going to end the presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Let's see, let me get to the right place here. Let me go up. Here we go. All right. I hope you enjoyed the tour of the background tour of Baltimore. And I will take your questions, but I thought what I wanted to do now is actually read from the Baltimore Bandit. So I'm going to do a reading and then answer any questions that we have. So thanks for sticking with me. That was a few more slides than normal, but some of it's pretty interesting. So I'm going to read from the first chapter. It's called, chapter 1 is called The Golden Slide. And you've already seen this illustration. Here we go. There's the illustration of Mike and Kate. Let me just get it on the picture. And you hold that in your head when I'm reading it to you. Pow! Mike Walsh said as he swung an imaginary bat. Babe Ruth blasts a home run in Baltimore. Mike's cousin, Kate Hopkins, watched his pretend baseball fly over the Orioles outfield. Uh-oh, crash! She said in an announcer's voice. He's the first player to hit a window in the big brick warehouse across the street. It was late on a Sunday afternoon, and Mike and Kate were waiting in line to run the bases after a Baltimore Orioles game. Well then, maybe I hit it, Mike said. And if you hit it, you'll have to pay for the broken window, Kate said. Mike shrugged. Okay, I guess I'll let Babe Ruth take that one, he said. But he can't have pancakes with flaps. Mike and Kate had come to Baltimore with Kate's mom, Laura Hopkins. She was a sports reporter for American Sports. She had arranged for Mike and Kate to meet the Orioles' star pitcher, Flaps Palmer, the following day for a pregame meal. Flaps was superstitious. Before each game he pitched, he insisted on having flapjacks for good luck. I might not be able to hit as well as Babe Ruth, Mike said, but I'll bet I can keep up with Flaps when it comes to eating pancakes. Kate nodded. When it comes to pancakes, you could keep up with a vacuum cleaner. Mike smiled. Yes, but I'd enjoy them more than the vacuum cleaner would. Mrs. Hopkins and the kids had arrived earlier that day from their home in Cooperstown, New York. They had watched the Sunday afternoon Orioles game at Oriole Park in Camden Yards. They also had front row seats near the dugout for the next day's game against the Seattle Mariners. Mike pointed to a long 8-story brick warehouse behind the Orioles outfield. Actually, I don't think Babe Ruth could have hit one of the windows in the warehouse, he said. Why not? Kate asked. Because back then, the Orioles played in a different stadium, Mike said. And also, even though he was born right near here, Babe Ruth was traded from the Orioles to the Boston Red Sox halfway through his first season. Back then, he was a pitcher, just like Flaps. I'll bet that's why Flaps is crazy about Babe Ruth, Kate said. At the ceremony before the game, they said Flaps is a huge fan. During the ceremony, a valuable baseball glove that Babe Ruth had once owned had been unveiled. It was an old, flat, brown glove, but it was worth over $250,000. The Orioles were going to put it on display in a room near the gift shop for the first time before the next day's game. Hey, look, it's our turn, Kate said. We're going to run the bases at a major league stadium. I know, Mike said. This is awesome. He high-fived Kate. A man standing in front of the Orioles dugout motioned for Mike and Kate to head to the batter's box. He wore a black and orange Orioles jersey and a big bushy beard. On his baseball cap was an image of a large white crab. Before Mike and Kate reached home plate, they heard the first few bars of Take Me Out to the Ball Game. The man held up his hand to motion for Mike and Kate to stop. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, which played the song as its ringtone. The man answered the phone. While he talked, Mike pulled a tennis ball out of the pocket in his shorts and tossed it to Kate. They played catch until the man hung up. He waved to Mike and Kate and pointed at home plate. Mike slipped the ball back into his pocket and they ran over. Ready to run the bases like a Baltimore Oriole, he asked. Are you two doing this together? Kate nodded. Okay, stand in the batter's box, he said. Take off when I say go. Mike and Kate crouched down, ready to run. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go, the man shouted. There's the picture I showed you before. Mike and Kate took off like a shot. Kate seized an early lead as she and Mike raced for first base. Mike Walsh has ripped another line drive deep to center field, Mike called as he ran. It's another amazing hit by this young superstar. Kate's foot touched first base just before Mike's. They headed to second. Mike Walsh is tearing up the base paths today, Mike yelled. He pulled a step ahead of Kate. A small cloud of dust rose behind them as they rounded second. Kate seemed to find extra power and shot ahead again, but Mike caught up near third. They thundered down third base and headed for home. It looks like it'll be close, Mike called out. Will Mike Walsh beat the throw? I think he will. Kate zoomed toward home plate. She was a step ahead of Mike. Mike made a split-second decision to slide. His heel hit the white rubber edge of the home plate just as Kate's right foot landed squarely in the center of the plate. Home run, she cried. I win! Mike slid across the home plate, leaving a trail of dust behind him. No way, Mike said as he stood up. My foot touched first. I won. No, I won, Kate said. Let's ask your mom, Mike said. Mrs. Hopkins had been standing just behind home plate watching them. Who won, Aunt Laura? It was very close, Mrs. Hopkins said. It's possible that Kate's foot landed first. You were behind her, Mike. Mike held up his hands. I know, he said. That's why I was sliding. Mike pointed to the far side of the plate. I started sliding right over there, and then my foot crossed, he said. Kate and Mrs. Hopkins waited for Mike to finish his thought, but he didn't. Instead, he scuffed at the dirt in the batter's box with the tip of his sneaker. Mike, is something wrong? Mrs. Hopkins asked. Mike ignored them. He dropped to the ground and dug with his fingers, then tugged at something from the dirt. Sunlight sparkled off a shiny gold coin. Look what I found, Mike said. Buried treasure. And that's the end of the first chapter. There we go. But I'm going to read a page of the next chapter to you. Chapter 2 is called A Birdman in Birdland. Buried treasure, Kate asked, in Camden Yards? Kate ran over to Mike and studied the gold coin. It was a little bigger than a quarter, and it had a picture of Babe Ruth on the front and the words Babe Ruth #1 on the back. Why would someone bury treasure under home plate, she asked. Mike smiled. He took the coin back from Kate and slipped it into his pocket. I don't know, he said, and maybe it's my reward for winning the race. And there's a little illustration of the Babe Ruth coin. I don't know about that, Kate said. I'm not even sure you won the race. Mike sighed. We can have a do-over at home, he said. It would be fun to keep the coin, but I should probably turn it into the Orioles. Maybe I'll get a big reward. That's a great idea, Mike, Mrs. Hopkins said. You can turn it in tomorrow at the Lost and Found office before your pancakes with flaps. And that's the end of today's reading. So Mike and Kate maybe find some buried treasure, but you also heard about the Babe Ruth baseball glove that is being unveiled, and I can tell you that something happens to that glove, and Mike and Kate have to try to find it after it goes missing. So that's the mystery in this book. It's a lot of fun. It incorporates a lot of cool Baltimore stuff as well as some Babe Ruth stuff. So let me take a quick look at any questions that have come in. Thank you for joining me. Hello, Owen. So Owen, thank you for joining us. Rachel is wondering, what is my least favorite team? I don't really have a least favorite team. I think I've told you previously that I have two favorite teams. My first favorite team is the Boston Red Sox because I live near Boston. And my second favorite team is whatever team I'm writing about. And I know somebody had asked about the Atlanta Braves. I'm actually writing about the Atlanta Braves right now. So that's my second favorite team. And I'm not done with the Atlanta Braves book. I'm only on chapter 2. I've got about 8 more chapters to go. That will be out next year or the year after. And it's going to be a fun mystery once I figure out what it is. Let's see. Corey wants to know who my favorite player is. I don't really have a favorite player yet. I'm kind of waiting for baseball to return. I used to really love Hank Aaron when I was little because he was a cool home run hitter. I love David Ortiz when he played on the Boston Red Sox, but he retired a few years ago. And I'm kind of waiting to see who's out there playing this year. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Amy wanted to know if I had any dog characters in my book. So I do. In book number maybe 14, let's see, the Cardinals caper, a little hard to see here. Right there, let's see, is it focus? You can see a dog on the cover. So Mike and Kate are in St. Louis at a St. Louis Cardinals game, and there is a dog that actually goes missing, and they have to find out what happens to the dog. So pick up, I think, book number 14. The Cardinals caper if you like dogs or pets. Kristen said she likes my books. Thank you. Hello, Jack. Owen, favorite teams. I've talked about that. Thank you, everyone. And Babe Ruth, Corey mentioned Babe Ruth hits moonshots. He sure does. He hits really long home runs. And Babe Ruth, Katie mentions that Babe Ruth used to play for the Orlando Yankees. He played for the New York Yankees, but maybe you're thinking of somebody else. I mentioned what the mystery was. And let's see, Benjamin sounds like he's watching today. So thank you for joining us, Benjamin. And he'd like to know if I visited every major league stadium. So there are 30 major league stadiums. I have written about 16 of them so far, and I'm working on 2 more books. So I've actually written about 18 of them. I have 12 more to go. I have not been to all 30. I have been to all 18 that I've written about, and I've been to about 3 or 4 more. So I've probably been to about 21 or 22 of the stadiums. I have 8 left to go, and it's really cool to be able to go visit all the different stadiums because they're all very different. Even if you live near one, it's really fun to see the other stadiums. And let me see what other questions we might have. So let's see. How many teams did I do? Corey wanted to know. I've written about 16 of the teams, and there are 2 more books on the way. There's going to be a Minnesota Twins mystery that comes out next year, and then Atlanta Braves mystery, and then hopefully more after that if Random House decides to make more. Michael wanted to know, do people stand in the street to mark the balls? So when a ball gets hit over into Utah Street, usually there are enough fans around there that they will see where the ball hits. And I assume if you're near a baseball that gets hit onto Utah Street, you just kind of stop and you either stand at that section where the ball hit or you point to it for when one of the officials comes to take a look at it. Good question. Let's see. Ben wants to know, is the reason you go to the dugout notes to give us additional information that you did not have in the book? So in these books, as I mentioned, there are dugout notes, which is the last chapter kind of a thing after the last chapter that looks like this. And it's a few pages that look like this that have interesting team facts. So it's where I put the nonfiction information because there is a lot of information that doesn't fit into the story. So I include that in the dugout notes section. And another question about how many ballparks I've been to. I've answered that one. Let's see if we have any further questions. So Robert from Long Island wanted to know if a ball landed on Utah Street when I was there. No, it did not. I think it doesn't occur all that often, but it looks like it might have when he went to one of the games. So that's kind of cool if you've been able to see that happen. That happens kind of rarely. And Sarah mentioned that she read 2 of my MVP books. So thank you very much, Sarah. These are, again, fun books with other mysteries. There's a School Olympics mystery, a soccer mystery, a big girls soccer game, something strange is happening at a soccer field, a football mystery called the Football Fumble, and a basketball mystery. So fun if you like other sports, or even if you like the ballpark mysteries, you'll probably like them. Let me see if I have any other new questions here. Benjamin says thank you. So thank you, Benjamin, for joining us again. And let's see. I can't wait, this is Corey, till baseball is back. And I agree with that. Question from Michael about, does Mark draw on a computer? I don't know. I think he might, because a lot of the illustrators that I know use a computer or an iPad to do the drawing. But I don't know. Mark may still do it by hand. The way he draws, I don't have examples. So maybe I'll do this in the future version of Ballpark Mysteries Live. Typically, he draws sketches. So he'll draw a sketch of this cover scene to make sure the composition is correct, the characters are right, the stuff in the background is right. And once he gets approval on the sketches, then he'll go back and actually do the detailed work. He'll actually do the drawing based upon the approved sketches. And I don't know whether he does them using, pencils or ink or paint, or if he does it on a computer. Let's see. Beth wants to know what my favorite ballpark food is. I'd say it's hot dogs. Hot dogs, French fries, but probably hot dogs. Although I really do like pretzels too, so it's kind of hard to pick. There are a lot of cool choices. Evan in Cleveland, what about a spring training book? That would be really cool. I've actually been thinking about that. I don't think I'm going to write one in the near future. We could do a super special on spring training. It could take place in Arizona because that's the Cactus League, or it could take place in Florida. That's the Grapefruit Spring Training League. And I've been to spring training games in both those locations. they're very different. It would be cool because you can actually get up much closer to the baseball players. The stadiums are smaller. They sign more autographs, so there's a lot more interaction. And it's easier to see more teams because they're all kind of in that same area. So it'd be kind of cool to try to come up with a mystery that would cross maybe multiple stadiums. But I don't have that planned right now. I have to wait for Random House to decide to publish more books. So then maybe we'd be able to do that. And Ben wants to know if I got a haircut. I got a haircut. Yeah, thanks. I was able to have my wife cut my hair last week, and I think it came out good enough. So thank you very much for asking. And looks like Brendan enjoyed the World Series Curse. I like that book as well. That's a Boston Red Sox versus Chicago Cubs book. And if you like the first book, you would like the World Series Curse, because the World Series Curse also takes place in Boston and Chicago. Katie would like me to write a hockey book. So I would love to write a hockey book. I haven't started one. I don't know whether I will, but maybe I will. I do get that request quite often. So it seems like there are a lot of people that want to read maybe a hockey mystery or a hockey adventure story, and that would be kind of cool. So it's something I'm definitely going to think about as I have time to do some more writing. And Corey mentioned she wants baseball. So I think that that's a great place to end. I hope baseball will come back pretty soon. I think it might in July. Thank you all for joining me again. It's really great to be able to have a dialogue with you and answer some of your questions about the books and show you some of the behind the scenes things that I do when I research the Ballpark Mystery books. And I'm going to take a break next week. So the next Ballpark Mysteries Live will probably be 2 weeks from now. Please check my Twitter account and my Facebook page called Ballpark Mysteries for any updates. But probably 2 Wednesdays from now, I think that's June 10th, we'll be doing it again at 2 o'clock. I don't know what book yet, so it'll be a mystery. But come back and join me. And if you also want to see the previous ones, check out any of the previous videos on my Facebook page, Ballpark Mysteries. Thank you very much. Keep reading. Pick up the Baltimore Bandit if you want to catch up on today's mystery, and you can go ahead and read the rest of the series if you want as well. So thank you very much, and we'll see you later on.